They tell you grief is the hardest thing an old man ever carries. It isn't. I found it out the week I buried my wife. The hardest thing is standing at the graveside of the woman you love for 50 years and realizing your own daughter is already doing arithmetic, dividing up what's left before the dirt is even settled, and sliding you the smallest piece with a smile like she's doing you a kindness. My daughter took the lake house. She handed me the keys to a collapsing old cabin in the hills like she was giving me a gift. She thought she'd won something. She had no idea that 3 weeks later, on my knees fixing a rotted floor in that cabin, I'd pry up one softboard and find out that my wife had been 3 moves ahead of her the entire time. My name is Vern Doyle. Most folks call me Vern. I'm 73 years old. I spent 50 years as a carpenter and cabinet maker here in the mountains of western North Carolina. 50 years of building things with my hands. Houses, furniture, staircases, cradles, coffins when a neighbor needed one. I never got rich at it. You don't get rich swinging a hammer in a small mountain town. But I learned things about how the world is built that no rich man ever learns. And one of them is at the center of this whole story. So hold on to it. The part of any structure that actually holds the weight is never the part you can see. It's the foundation, the joists, the timber under the floor. The pretty part on top is just the part that gets admired. The part underneath is the part that keeps you standing. My daughter never learned that. My wife knew it better than anyone I ever met. Before I tell you what my wife hid under that floor, do an old man one small kindness. If you've ever been handed the smallest piece and told to be grateful for it, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the person it was meant for. Give a like as well. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you a question I still turn over at night, and I want to know how you'd have answered it. Let me tell you about my wife first, because nothing in this makes sense without her. Lorraine and I were married for 50 years. We met when we were 19, and we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and the first thing we ever built was that cabin. With our own hands, one summer on 60 acres of hill country my grandfather left me. The only thing anyone ever left me. We built it board by board. We spent our wedding night in it before the roof was even finished, looking up at the stars through the rafters. We raised our daughter's earliest years in it before we moved down to town for the schools. That cabin wasn't a building to me. It was the first thing Lorraine and I ever made together, and every board in it had my young hands and her young laughter in it. Later, when I'd had a few good years and saved a little, we bought a second place, a nice modern house down on the lake, the kind of place with big windows and a dock where the family could gather in the summers. The lake house was where the grandchildren learned to swim. It was lovely, but it was never home the way the cabin was home. The lake house was the pretty part on top. The cabin was the foundation. Lorraine understood the difference in her bones. I want you to understand how much of us was in that cabin because it matters for what my wife did. The door frames still had the pencil marks where we'd measured Paige's height as a little girl before we moved to town. The mantle over the hearth I'd carved myself the winter Lorraine was pregnant, working by lamplight, my hands shaking from cold and nerves both. There was a heart with our initials that I'd cut into a floor joist when I was 19 and stupid and in love, hidden where no one would ever see it, in the crawl space under that very floor. 50 years later, I'd forgotten it was even there. Lorraine hadn't. Lorraine never forgot a single thing that mattered. That, it would turn out, was the whole difference between my wife and my daughter. One of them remembered where the love was buried, and the other only ever counted what was sitting out on the table. We have one child, our daughter, Paige. She's 40. I'll try to be fair to Paige, because she's my blood and I love her still, God help me. But I have to tell you the truth about her, because the truth is the whole point. Somewhere along the way, our girl came to believe that love and money were the same thing, that a person's worth was measured in what they had, and that the people around her were mostly assets to be managed. She married a man named Cole who believed the same, and the two of them built a life that looked expensive and cost more than they had, and they spent a lot of years waiting, not very patiently, for their inheritance to arrive. I watched Paige's visits to us change over the years. They got shorter and more scheduled, and somehow always seemed to circle back to the properties. Have you two thought about your estate planning? That lake house is worth a fortune now, Dad. You know that. You really should get everything in order for our sake. Lorraine noticed it before I did. Lorraine noticed everything. She'd catch my eye when Paige started in on the estate planning, and there'd be a sadness in her look I didn't fully understand until much later. Because Lorraine understood something about our daughter that I was too soft or too much her father to let myself see. She understood that when the time came, Paige would not grieve us. Paige would inventory us. Lorraine got sick 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer. A long, slow decline that gave us a great deal of time. Time I'll always be grateful for because I got to hold her hand through all of it in time that I would learn my wife used far more wisely than I knew. Because in those last years, while I was focused entirely on keeping Lorraine comfortable, my daughter was focused on something else. Paige came around more in those final months, and everyone thought, how sweet, Paige is spending time with her dying mother. But Paige wasn't sitting with Lorraine out of love. She was working her, gently, persistently, bringing up the will, bringing up the lake house, suggesting, in that reasonable voice, that maybe things should be clarified now, while Mom was still able to sign. I caught pieces of it and told myself I was imagining it. I'd come back from the pharmacy and find Paige leaning over her mother's bed with papers, and she'd fold them away too quickly and say they were just some things for later. I found out afterward from the attorney what those papers were. Paige had twice brought documents for Lorraine to sign in those final foggy months. A new division weighted heavily toward Paige, and once a power of attorney that would have handed Paige control of everything while her mother was still alive. And twice, Lorraine, dying in pain, drifting in and out, had refused to sign. My wife spent some of the last clear strength she had on this earth saying no to our daughter. I didn't know that then. If I had, I might have understood sooner what was coming. But Lorraine never told me, because she didn't want me to have to carry the knowledge of what Paige was while I was already carrying the loss of her. She carried it alone from her sickbed, so I wouldn't have to. And she made her own quiet plans instead. I didn't see it clearly at the time, but Lorraine did. Lorraine saw all of it from her sickbed with a clarity that dying sometimes gives people. And my wife made a decision she never told me about. Not until she told me from beyond the grave, in an envelope under a floorboard. Lorraine passed a little over a month ago. At home, in the spring, with the windows open. I won't tell you about that morning. Some things stay between a man and his wife. The funeral was on a Saturday, and the very next week, friend, Paige and Cole sat me down at my own kitchen table to handle the estate. I was a hollow thing that week. I'd have signed anything. I'd have agreed to anything, just to make the talking stop. And Paige knew that. She'd have known that about a grieving man, even if the grieving man weren't her own father. She laid it out like she'd rehearsed it because she had. The estate was simple, she said. 2 properties plus some savings. And she'd thought a lot about what would be fairest and easiest for everybody. She proposed that she and Cole take the lake house because she said they had the kids, they'd actually use it, and it needed someone younger to manage a property like that. And I, she said, would of course want the cabin. It means so much to you and Mom, Dad. All those memories. It's really the sentimental one. It should be yours. She was good at it. I'll give her that. She'd built the whole thing so that saying no would make me look like the greedy one, like a bitter old man trying to take the lake house from his own grandchildren. Every word was aimed to make her generosity to herself feel like generosity to me. She even got a little misty when she talked about all those memories at the cabin, and I remember thinking through my fog how tender she was being. That's the craft of a certain kind of person. They can make you grateful in a moment for the exact thing they're doing to you. Cole nodded along beside her, steady, saying little, the way a man does when the play is already working and all he has to do is not knock over the set. The cabin. The collapsing cabin. 60 acres of overgrown hill country in a hand-built cabin that hadn't been touched in 15 years, with a sagging porch and a leaking roof and, as I'd find out, a rotting floor. The sentimental one. Worth, by any measure Paige and Cole cared about, almost nothing. While the lake house, the modern house with the dock and the big windows, easily worth 6 or 7 times what a broken-down cabin could fetch, went to them. She dressed it up so beautifully. She made taking the valuable property and handing her grieving father a ruined sound like an act of tender generosity toward my feelings. Cole nodded along, and there was a document already drawn up, of course, a division agreement with the little tabs where I was supposed to sign. And I want you to sit with me in this moment, friend, because it's the one everybody asks about. I signed it. I signed away the lake house. I let my daughter take the valuable property and leave me the ruin. And I did it with a small, sad smile. And I said, "Thank you, sweetheart. The cabin's exactly what I'd want." And I meant it. That's the part Paige could never have understood. I didn't want a cabin. I'd have chosen the cabin over the lake house every day of my life because the cabin was Lorraine and me at 19, and the lake house was just a nice building. Paige thought she was fleecing a grieving old fool. And in her mind, a man who'd choose the ruin over the mansion was exactly the fool worth fleecing. She signed her name to that agreement so fast, so greedily, in writing, in front of Cole, and in front of the notary she'd brought. She had no idea she'd just signed away the single most valuable thing my wife owned. And neither did I. Not yet. If you're still with me, friend, do an old man that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what was under that floor. Because what was under that floor is the reason I know now that my wife loved me more than I ever managed to say while she was alive. I moved up to the cabin 2 weeks later, sold most of the house in town, kept my tools, and went home because it was home, the truest home I'd ever had. And a carpenter doesn't sit in a ruin and feel sorry for himself. A carpenter fixes it. So I started restoring the cabin Lorraine, and I built 50 years before, board by board, the same way we'd built it the first time. The floor was the worst of it. The old pine floorboards near the hearth had gone soft with 50 years of damp, and some of them were rotted clean through. So on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after my daughter took the lake house, I got down on my knees with a pry bar to pull up the rotted boards and lay new ones. And under the third board I lifted, set down into a gap between the joists where no one would ever look, was a metal box. A fireproof strong box, old, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store decades ago, wrapped in an oilcloth to keep the damp out, placed there carefully, deliberately, by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and exactly where nobody would ever think to look. I sat back on my heels on that half-torn-up floor, and my heart started going because I knew that oilcloth. It was one of Lorraine's. She'd used it for years to wrap the good pie plates when we hauled them up to the cabin for the family. I hadn't seen it in a decade, and I understood before I ever opened the box that my wife had put something under this floor. In this cabin, the cabin she'd made sure, from her sickbed, would come to me. The floor she knew I'd get down on my knees and rebuild board by board because she knew exactly the kind of man she'd married and exactly the kind of daughter she'd raised and exactly which one of us would ever kneel down and look underneath. I pried the box open with shaking hands. The first thing on top was money. Cash, banded, careful, the way a frugal woman saves it over a lifetime, a little at a time, off the top of the grocery money, for 50 years. I didn't count it right then, but it was thousands, tens of thousands. My Lorraine, who I thought I knew everything about, had been quietly setting money aside our entire marriage and hiding it in the cabin we built, and never once told me. Under the cash was a small velvet bag, and in it were gold coins. Not a fortune in coins, but real ones, the kind you buy when you don't trust banks and you've lived through hard times. More of Lorraine's quiet, decades-long carefulness. I held them in my hand, and I could almost see her doing it, driving up to the cabin alone on some ordinary afternoon over the years, on some errand I never thought twice about, kneeling down on this floor, lifting this board, adding to the box. A whole secret life of provision, carried out in the one place she knew was safe, in the place we built. But it wasn't the money that made me sit down flat on that floor and lose my breath. It was what was under the money. A folder. And in the folder, the deed to the cabin. The original deed to all 60 acres. And clipped to it, a survey. A recent survey dated 18 months ago when Lorraine was already sick. She'd had the land surveyed while she was dying, and I never knew. And clipped to that was a letter on the letterhead of a land company, and it was an offer. A standing offer to purchase the 60 acres of the cabin's land. Because here's what my daughter never bothered to learn in all her arithmetic. That worthless cabin sat on 60 acres of mountain land with nearly a half-mile of river frontage, and the water rights that come with it, in a county where developers have been buying up every acre of buildable riverfront they could get their hands on for the better part of a decade. The lake house sat on a third of an acre. The cabin sat on 60, with a river running through it. The offer in that folder for the land my daughter had so generously let her sentimental old father keep was for $1.8 million. The lake house Paige had grabbed so quickly, so greedily, in writing, was worth perhaps $300,000. I sat there on the torn-up floor, and I did the arithmetic 3 times, because a carpenter checks his measurements before he cuts. There was no mistake. The little lot, with a pretty view, was worth $300,000. The 60 ugly, overgrown acres with a half-mile of river and the water rights nobody in the family had ever thought about were worth 6 times that, and climbing every year the county grew. My daughter had taken the pretty part on top, and she had left me the foundation. She had left me the timber under the floor, and she had done it certain, absolutely certain, that she was the clever one and I was the fool. I found out later she'd never even had the cabin land appraised. Why would she? It was a fallen-down shack in the woods. She'd valued the whole 60 acres at the price of the firewood. It never once occurred to her that the ugly, overgrown, unglamorous land could be worth 6 times her price, because Paige, like most people, could only see value in the part that looked like value. She'd spent her whole life admiring the grain and ignoring the wood. And under all of it, at the very bottom of the box, was the letter I'll carry to my own grave. In Lorraine's handwriting, addressed to me. I'm not going to read you all of it. Some of it is only mine. But I'll tell you what it said, in her words, because you need to hear it to understand what my wife did. She wrote that she was sorry to be telling me this way, from under a floor, but that she'd known me for 50 years and known our daughter for 40, and she'd had to be careful. She wrote that she'd watched Paige circle us like weather for years, and that she'd made her peace with the fact that our girl loved money more than she'd ever love us, and that it wasn't my fault and it wasn't hers. It was just true, and pretending otherwise would only get me hurt. And then she wrote the part that broke me. She wrote, I know Paige, Vern. When we're gone, she'll take the lake house. She'll take the shiniest thing she can see, and she'll leave you the cabin and feel generous about it, because she's never once understood which of our 2 houses was worth more, in dollars or in anything else. So I'm leaving you here what she'll never think to look for. Not to punish her. I've left her enough, and she has the children, and I've provided for them in ways she doesn't know yet either. But because you built this place with me when we were children, and you deserve the truth of it and the safety of it, and I could not bear to leave you dependent on her mercy. Sell the land or don't, my love. Live in our cabin or don't. But do it as a free man, standing on your own foundation. I put under the floor because I knew that's the one place our daughter would never kneel down and look. And I knew you would, because you're the only person I ever met who understood that the part underneath is the part that holds the weight. That's why I married you. Fix the floor, Vern, and then go live. My wife, dying, seeing our daughter clearly, had reached forward in time and protected me from her, and had done it in a way that made me get down on my knees in our first home to receive it. She knew Paige would never look under the floor, and she knew I would, because I'd spend the rest of my life fixing that floorboard by board out of love, and she trusted that love to find her final gift. I sat on that floor with her letter in my hands until the light went out of the windows and the cabin got dark around me, and I didn't turn on a lamp. I just held it. 50 years I was married to that woman, and I thought I'd known the whole of her. I hadn't. I never knew about the box or the coins or the survey she'd ordered while she was dying, or the 2 times she said no to our daughter from sickbed, or the quiet, ferocious, patient way she'd been protecting me from the one danger I couldn't see. She loved me so much that she planned around my blind spots. She loved me so much that she made her last act on this earth a hiding place, so that a foolish, soft-hearted old carpenter would never have to stand in front of his own daughter with his hand out. I'd spent 3 years thinking I was the one taking care of her. And it turned out, right to the very end and past it, she was taking care of me. Now let me tell you how it went when Paige found out. Because of course she found out. A developer's agent, not knowing the family's arrangements, contacted Paige a few weeks later. They'd had the 60 acres on their list for years and assumed the family still held it together, and they wanted to renew their offer. And that is how my daughter learned, from a stranger's phone call, that the sentimental ruin she'd so generously left her father was worth $1.8 million. She was at my cabin within 2 hours. She came in fast and hot, and the tender voice from the kitchen table was gone. She said there had been a mistake. She said the division wasn't fair and wasn't what Mom would have wanted, and that obviously we needed to redo it properly now that we had better information. She said the cabin land should be split, that it was family land, that I couldn't possibly want to keep all of that for my own daughter and grandchildren. I noticed she never once, in all of it, said she was sorry. Not for the kitchen table. Not for handing her grieving father a ruin and calling it a gift. Not for 2 hours of family land and what Mom would have wanted from a woman who'd spent her mother's dying months trying to get her to sign the family land away. There was no apology in her anywhere, because in Paige's mind she hadn't done anything wrong. She'd simply made a bad trade, and bad trades were meant to be undone. She wasn't angry that she'd treated me terribly. She was angry that treating me terribly hadn't paid. I let her talk. I've learned that you let a person say all of it because all of it tells you who they are. And when she was done, I said quietly, "Paige, 3 weeks ago you sat at my kitchen table, and you told me the lake house should go to you because you'd actually use it. And you told me the cabin was the sentimental one, and it should be mine. And you had a document drawn up, and you signed it in front of a notary before I did. You chose. You weren't tricked. Nobody hid anything from you. You had every chance in the world to have this land appraised. And you didn't because you were so sure you were cheating your grieving father that you couldn't be bothered. The division is done, sweetheart. It closed the day you signed it. I checked with your mother's attorney. It's airtight. And here is the part one take no pleasure in. My daughter looked at me, and the thing that came in her face when she understood there was no undo, that she had, with her own greedy signature, locked herself out of the real prize, was not shame. It was not grief for the way she'd treated me. It was pure, cold fury at having been outmaneuvered. By me. By her fool of a father. She didn't see, even then, what she'd done. She only saw what she'd lost. She threatened to sue. Her lawyer told her, gently, what your mother's attorney told me, that a signed, notarized division agreement between competent adults, where nothing was concealed and the complaining party simply failed to do her own due diligence, is about as unwinnable a case as exists. She'd chosen the lake house of her own free, greedy will. There was no court on earth that would give her a second bite because she was too busy fleecing me to check what she was fleecing. She'd already borrowed against the lake house, too, it turned out. Over-leveraged it, the way she and Cole over-leveraged everything, betting on the inheritance that was always coming. So she couldn't even walk away clean. She was stuck with the pretty house she'd grabbed and the debt she'd stacked on it, and the knowledge that the ugly one she'd thrown at her father was the one worth a fortune. Now here's where the story stops being about who won and becomes the hard part one still wrestle with. I could have kept every dime. It was mine legally, completely, and God knows she'd earned losing it. But I sat with Lorraine's letter for a long time. Not to punish her, my wife had written. She has the children. So I did something my daughter did not deserve and would never have done for me. I sold the land. I'm too old to develop it, and Lorraine told me to go live. And I put a large piece of the money, more than a fair share, into a trust. Not for Paige, for my grandchildren, for their education, their futures, locked up where their parents' debts and bad bets can't touch it, to be theirs when they're grown. Because they are innocent in all of this, and because it's what Lorraine would have wanted, and because I'm not going to let my daughter's greed teach me to be as small as she is. I structured it carefully the way I frame a wall, so it holds. The trust pays out to the grandchildren directly. At ages they'll be old enough to handle it, and not $1 of it can be borrowed against or reached by Paige and Cole in the meantime. I'd watched my daughter try to spend an inheritance that hadn't arrived yet for 20 years. I wasn't going to hand her another one to bet the lake house against. If she wants to be part of those children's good future, she can do it the honest way, by being their mother. The money is theirs, and it's out of her reach, and that's the most loving and the most careful thing I know how to do with it. I told Paige what I'd done. I told her the door was open, that I was her father, that I'd always be her father, and that if she ever wanted to sit with me at the cabin and be honest about what happened, I'd put the coffee on. She hasn't come. She's still angry. Not at herself, at me for the crime of not being the fool she needed me to be. Maybe someday that'll change. I keep the coffee ready, but I've stopped standing on the porch waiting for a car that doesn't come. The cabin is my home now, full-time. I fixed the floor, new pine boards, laid true, and I'll tell you, I laid that last board over the empty gap where the box had been with a lump in my throat you could choke on. The porch doesn't sag anymore. The roof is tight. I sit out there in the evenings where Lorraine and I sat as kids, and my grandchildren come up on the weekends when Paige allows it, and they're learning to use my tools, and it is a good and quiet and honest life. I spent 50 years building things, friend, and I'll leave you with the truest thing I know, the thing my wife knew better than I did. People will always reach for the pretty grain, the shiny house, the big view, the part that photographs well. And they'll leave behind the plain, unglamorous, load-bearing thing because it doesn't look like much. But everything that lasts, every house, every marriage, every life worth living, is built on the part nobody wants to look at, the foundation, the timber under the floor, the quiet person who was holding the whole thing up the entire time. My daughter took the part that looked like value. My wife left me the part that was value. And the difference between those two women is the difference between everything I've ever loved and everything I've ever pitied. Paige told me at that kitchen table that the cabin was the sentimental one. She was right. She just never once understood that sentiment in my family was where we kept the gold. Now here's my question, and I mean it because I truly go back and forth. I put a fortune into a trust for the grandchildren of a daughter who tried to fleece me, because my wife's letter asked me not to punish her, and because those kids are innocent. But some nights, I wonder if I'm just teaching Paige that there are no consequences, that Dad will always, in the end, take care of everyone who wrongs him. Was I right to be generous to the children of the woman who did this? Or does mercy, past a certain point, just become one more floor for someone like her to walk all over? Tell me how you see it down in the comments. I honestly don't know. If this story meant something to you, do an old man that kindness. Subscribe, hit like, and go look a little closer at the plain, unglamorous things and the plain, unglamorous people in your life. That's where the weight is always carried. That's where the gold is always kept. And it's almost never the part that photographs well. I'll see you next time.